Okay, folks, we'll start in a minute. We're just, there's Councillor DeRusse there now. Okay, and Councillor Wilkinson, are you ready? We'll get going. Okay, good morning and welcome to the Audit Committee of Thursday, the 14th of June, 2018. Thank you all for attending. Is there any declarations of interest from the committee? Seeing none. Thank you. And confirmation of the minutes from our last meeting, which was the 30th of April, 2018, and minutes number 15. Confirmed? Thank you. Okay, we can now go through the agenda. Item 1, the 2017 City of Ottawa Consolidated Financial Statements. Finance staff and Ernst & Young will be presenting, so let's hold that item. Item number 2, Sinking Fund Financial Statements. I believe we have a technical amendment that will be done at Council on that one?
Item 1.
On item 1, okay, sorry. So on item 2, is that item carried as is? Okay, thank you. Item 3, the Office of the Auditor General report on audit follow-ups and detailed audit follow-up reports. CAG has a presentation, so we'll hold that item as well. Vice Chair Kluge, I believe you have a motion to add the supporting documentation.
Thank you, Chair Hubley. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Whereas the supporting documentation titled Office of the Auditor General Report on the Audit Follow-ups and Detailed Audit Follow-up Reports was not circulated with the agenda package, therefore be it resolved that the Audit Committee approve the addition of this document for consideration by the Committee at today's meeting pursuant to Section 89.3 of the Procedure Bylaw, being Bylaw 2016-377.
Is that motion carried? Thank you. Okay, as prior practice with our Audit Committee, the AG will provide a presentation in open session. Then committee will proceed to move in camera to hear details on the follow-up to the 2011 audit of contract management practices, Spring Hill Landfill Site contract, and additional 2018 audit procedures. Are there any questions on this process? Okay, we're good. Okay, let's proceed with item number 1 on the agenda, which was the 2017 City of Ottawa Consolidated Financial Statements. We have 2 presentations, Isabel Jasmine, Deputy City Treasurer, and Susie Gignac from Ernst & Young. Welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I will present the financial statements for the year ended December 31st, 2017. We will also have Ernst & Young with us today, Susie Gignac, the EY partner responsible for this audit. They are here to present the results of the audit after I've made my presentation. Nous avons aujourd'hui Ernst & Young qui vont présenter les résultats de leur vérification des états financiers à la conclusion de ma présentation des résultats pour l'année fiscale du 31 décembre 2017. So we're reporting a surplus for the year ended December 31st, 2017 of $462 million, which is different from the $25 million surplus reported at the end of 2017 for budget purposes. Financial statements are reported based on Canadian public sector accrual accounting standards, whereas the budget is reported on a modified cash basis to better align revenue or cash inflows with expenditures or cash outflows. The key difference between the 2 methods is that the accrual method also recognizes revenues and expenditures that are expected to be received or expended in a future reporting period. Also records capital expenditures as tangible capital assets and only recognizes as an expense the amortization of that capital asset. The accumulated surplus represents the net of all the city's accumulated assets and liabilities. It is comprised of the total of all tangible capital assets and reserves less future liabilities. The accumulated surplus essentially represents the value of the net assets available for future generations. The city's overall accumulated surplus increased by $457 million in 2017. Most of that increase is due to the annual operating surplus. Overall net debt has increased to $2.21 billion, but so has the value of the non-financial assets, which is primarily comprised of tangible capital assets such as roads, water and wastewater infrastructure, buildings, land, equipment, and all assets under construction. Non-financial assets increased by $843 million. I will provide additional details on each line item in the next few slides. The most significant financial assets are in the form of cash and equivalents, cash and investments. In 2017, the city continued to shift from long-term investments to cash and cash equivalents in order to align with the cash flow requirements of major capital projects, including the Confederation Line. The last item in this table represents the value of the net assets for Hydro Ottawa, which we report on our financial statements on an equity basis. The city received dividends from Hydro Ottawa in the amount of $21 million in 2017, related to results from the 2016 operations. We had an increase in accounts payable and accrued liabilities primarily from higher accrued expenditures related to Stage 1 and now Stage 2 of the light rail, and also increased payables related to tax remissions from appeals. The accrued liability also includes payroll decreases due to timing differences in scheduled pay accruals or unsettled collective agreements, other employee costs. Deferred revenue primarily includes the development charges collected but not yet spent on projects. In 2017, there was an increase in development charges applied to Confederation Lines. Funding from government reached its limit in 2017 per the agreed-to funding schedules. The next slides will provide additional details on the next two major items, employee future benefits and pensions and net long-term debt. Employee future benefits represent benefits earned but not payable until future years based on actuarial assumptions and changes in legislation. It is only an estimate and may or may not reflect the actual amounts that could be paid in the future. The amount payable in the current year is budgeted for each year, and the amount shown here is the total estimated future benefits. The most significant changes were primarily related to post-retirement and post-employment benefits, which increased by $34 million, mainly due to an increase in long-term disability claims and an increase in post-retirement benefits primarily due to an aging workforce. These increases were partially offset by $7 million reduction in the liability for the City of Ottawa Superannuation Fund, which was primarily due to better than expected investment returns. Our net long-term debt increased to $2.03 billion this year due to a debt issuance in 2017 of $432 million. As you recall, we issued debt that was planned for 2018 in 2017 to take advantage of lower interest rates. What is important to note is that debt is only used to fund capital, and although total net debt is increasing each year, so is the city's investment in assets while maintaining debt servicing within established targets. When you look at the debt level compared to the total cost of the city's gross assets, it represents 9.9% of those assets. Principal and interest payments represent 8% of the city's own source revenues, which is significantly below the provincial limit of 25%. Council has also established specific targets for debt whereby principal and interest payments for tax rate and supported debt are not to exceed combined target of 8.5% of the city's own source revenue, and in 2017 this percentage was at 5.95%. So the overall value of assets based on cost increased by $1.1 billion in 2017. The most significant construction projects contributing to the increase is Confederation Line Phase 1, $284 million, Confederation Line Phase 2, $226 million, roads, $182 million, water, wastewater infrastructure, $235 million. As you can see from the chart, water and wastewater infrastructure makes up 28% of the total tangible capital asset net book value. That's it for my presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions on that report before? Just a question, Mr. Chair. And on slide number 7, Madam Deputy Treasurer, you talk about legacy pension and transit and COSF. What's that mean? Put your mic on.
There are two stranded pension plans. The members of this pension plan, COSF is a closed member pension plan in transit. Some are still active, but on the OMERS plan. This was closed many years ago, and the city continues to maintain these plans. So we don't report OMERS on the city's financial statements. These are the only two that we actually do manage, maintain, and report on financial statements.
So there were, you said it was 10 in 2016 and now down to 3. How can you explain that to us?
So that's the total net value. So those are now showing a surplus of $3 million in total.
It's a change in 17. we do contribute to unfunded liabilities. COSF, which stands for City of Ottawa Superannuation Fund. We make, when required, under the pension legislation, we make contributions to that. And the same for the OC Transpo. They have a legacy pension plan that we still maintain. We would make contributions as required under the Pensions Act. But yes, we make contributions for sick leave, for vacation leave, and I think our total was somewhere around $57 million that we've set aside to fund future employee liabilities. So it's built into your base budget every year, all the expenses, but many years ago, this council agreed that if we had surplus in any of those accounts that are built into the annual operating budget, we would contribute that to the reserve on an ongoing basis to make certain that this liability is offset to a certain extent by funds within the city's reserve accounts.
And do we still have contribution to the WSIB, or we have our own, like we fund our own when it comes to WSIB?
WSIB was one that we agreed we would not set aside money for because it is built into your annual budget every year. We are required to assess what the future liability would be for those who are on WSIB, but we don't set aside a reserve to pay for that into the future. Long-term disability, though, we do. But WSIB, we pay that every year, and we've adjusted your budget over the years. If you remember, a couple of years ago when we had the presumptive cancers, we increased the WSIB budget for fire significantly.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Treasurer.
Thank you, Councillor Al-Santeri. Councillor Wilkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, on slide 6. Yeah, by the way. What are the environmental liabilities? I didn't get that clearly from your presentation.
Those are the amounts that we have estimated based on actuarial estimates for active and inactive landfill sites and contaminated sites.
Okay, so that's something that we have to we evaluate this each year depending on what we find out, because I think from the later report today we might be dealing with that again.
We evaluate the estimates every year. We do a full re-estimate every 3 years to look at the remaining useful life of some of these sites, and then what the costs associated with closing them
So that
for the next 25 years.
We do have some funds. We do have a reserve for those as well, do you not? Is this the net of the reserve, or does it include the reserve?
This is the gross amount.
Okay. And the second one on there is mortgage leases and others. That's just, isn't that, I recall from other years, that's the value of the leases and things we have that we pay out every year, but we have to show them because they're a liability for future years in our statement. I believe that's what it is.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's good for the leases, and then the mortgages are for the housing.
So that these are things we then I put in the budget every year to pay for what that is each year, because I've seen it in the budget.
Correct.
So it's not something that's going to come back to haunt us very much.
No.
It shouldn't anyway.
No, we put the money aside every year.
And the other question is on I think it's 10. Let me just find it. 9. The chart. I was surprised to see with all the roads we've got that it's only 15% of our asset. I know these are actually the value of them today, which means it depends on the condition of the roads and things, and that will put the value of them down.
It's based on depreciation estimates. Roads are amortized on what? How many years? Do you know? Anyway, it's based on an amortization. It's not a reflection of the state of the road. It's based on the amortization.
But it does give an indication of how old our roads are before they've been finished. I think it's an indicator. We all know we have problems with our roads. And I think that the percentage of the value of the assets, when we consider how many we have and how important they are, is actually quite low. And that's probably an indication of the need for doing more there. I don't know if the transportation people are here or not, but anyway. And the land that's fairly significant, the value of the land. I know it's we have our buildings and things, and I do know that we have some that I continue to work on selling for you, but This is lands that we actually need then. And the value of land's going up, so this must be going up then.
I can look it up to see if it went up.
It's rather a sizable amount.
But it represents the value of all the land that we own, yes.
Which is more than the value of our roads, which is quite interesting.
But land does not depreciate.
Well, land doesn't depreciate, it just goes up.
That's the difference.
Councillor, if I can just add something, this is the depreciated value, and it is based on the book value. So the land, when we buy it, gets entered in at the value we buy it, and it never changes after that. Whereas the road, you put the road on at what it costs you to construct it, and then you continue to depreciate it. So it will continue to go down over time. So these are historical cost values that have been depreciated. If this was a replacement value, if this was actually what this is worth on the market today, this would be over $32 billion. But this is a historical book value that has been depreciated.
That means that the roads, if you rebuild a road or you repave it, you reevaluate that value at that time and then depreciate it again?
If we built a new road, it would get added on there at the cost that we spent to build it. If we repave it, though, that's considered part of the normal life of it. It actually doesn't increase the value of it. It just allows it to extend to the life that we have established for that road, which in most cases is 15 years. So that 15 years assumes that you are going to have, I think, 2 repavings during that time period. So some capital works that we do actually don't increase your assets. Some of them do.
I think a road's life is more than 15 years, I hope. Anyway,
it depends on the type of road it is. Your residential versus your arterial versus your collector, they all have different lives.
You're talking about the road being kept in good condition after 15 years. We have roads that are over 100, 200 years old.
That's true, but at one point in time, we would have had to completely reconstruct it, and we would have put that value on of that reconstruction at that time and started to depreciate it again.
So some of the really old roads that have been reconstructed for 20, 30, 40, 50 years would be worth zero right now then?
There would be roads likely on our list that have zero value that are fully depreciated.
Okay, thank you. Just the accounting system, I realize that, but I think it's something we need to be aware of because people look at these and ask questions.
Okay, thank you, Council. Welcome to
Just to follow up on the question, that the land did go up by $38 million from 2016. $38 million.
Councilor Wilkinson, maybe we can take that offline after, and we'll go to Councilor Eggline now, if that's okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that I heard during the presentation that you've assigned some asset value to assets arising out of Stage 2 of LRT, and since we haven't really started building Stage 2 in any significant way, just wondering where that money comes from or where that value comes from.
So there is some work going on the maintenance facility.
Right.
There's also all the other work that gets capitalized. So
all the which, sorry?
The preliminary Stage 2 work that gets capitalized.
Okay. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Councilor Eggline. So we can now move on to your presentation, Susan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. While they're just getting it up, I'll just give a little bit of background. So we're engaged to issue an opinion on the financial statements to state whether we believe they're fairly stated in accordance with public sector accounting standards. We do have some procedures that remain until the financial statements are actually approved by Council. June 27th, I believe it's expected to be. The audit is ongoing. However, we present our results based on where we are today, and at this point in time, we do believe, based on what we found, that we will be issuing an unmodified or what's called a clean audit opinion. So what we thought we would do is just at a high level, based on our plan, we were able to rely on controls as we expected. We relied on the IT general controls, payroll controls, purchases, payables, and payments, and on the entity level controls. And I'll just quickly quickly run through the areas where we focused and the differences that we identified. So the first slide here is talking to three areas where we focus, which is around revenue recognition, contingent liabilities, and investments in financial instruments. We do substantive procedures where we actually look at the revenue that's been recognized in the detailed transactions over revenue recognition. We didn't identify any issues. We look at contingent liabilities. We confirm with in-house and external legal counsel to identify any liabilities that need to be accrued and disclosed, and no issues were noted. And then we look at investments in financial instruments. We confirm with the custodian the existence and completeness of those investments. We recalculate the carrying value, the accrued interest, and we test the market value of a sample of investments, and no issues were identified in those areas. The next area is employee future benefits. We put a fair amount of emphasis on this area. We do perform substantive procedures over both the Ottawa-Carleton Transit Commission Employees Pension Plan and the City of Ottawa's Superannuation Fund. We look at the liabilities on the non-pension post-retirement and post-employment benefits and WSIB, and we consider the assumptions. We have our internal actuarial specialists look at the valuations and get comfortable with the assumptions used. As a result, we did identify some misstatements, and when we're assessing those misstatements for all of these areas, we really look at the areas assessed against our materiality, and then we consider both quantitative and qualitative factors to determine whether we think these would impact a user's decision based on the financial statements. So the areas that were identified here were an understatement of employee future benefits related to indexation of COSF. This is an ongoing error that's been around for a number of years, as well as an understatement of employee future benefits related to some pre-existing plan provisions that had not been included. Those two errors are prior period errors, so there's really very little impact on your annual surplus, and so the difference is approximately $23.3 million combined, and it's not considered material to the financial statements. The second area is tangible capital assets. We put a lot of focus here based on the fact that it's a very significant balance on your statement of financial position, and there's a lot of transactions going on. We look at the additions, the disposals, and the amortization of those assets. We do rely on controls over your purchases, payables, and payments, and your amortization in the system. And we do look at agreements around large purchases or construction projects like Ottawa Light Transit and the Arts Corps projects. We did identify some differences here as well. Two overstatements of tangible capital assets, both related to when depreciation should have taken place in the past. And again, because they're related to prior years, there's really very little impact on your annual surplus in the current year, and we did not feel they were material to the financial statements. Next area is commitments. There were no issues in this area. We just wanted you to be informed that we do focus on this area and the disclosures, and we do perform some standard procedures to make sure it's fully disclosed. Move on to net long-term debt, which was one of the liabilities on your statement of financial position. We do confirm the city's debt. We test the occurrence of debt repayments, and we verify that there's a completeness of the debt principal repayments disclosure, and then we assess against the compliance limits. Based on our work, we did identify that the city is netting the long-term receivable related to light rail transit with the long-term debt related to the similar project. It's approximately $225 million, and that they are also netting the interest income and interest expense of $5.5 million in the current year. We did note that the terms are identical between these two, between the receivable and the payable, and the city does intend to settle. So the way it's presented represents the substance of the transaction. However, we did identify it as a difference because it is shown that we don't believe it has a material impact to the users of the financial statements. We do have a slight change to our audit results with respect to this particular item, which was posted on Radar. Our audit is ongoing, as I mentioned, and audit results are drafted until the point in time when they are approved by council. And this is just that the netting is between the long-term receivable and payable, rather than between the long-term debt and the accounts payable line item. And the differences have no impact on the net debt line item, which is the ratio in your statement of financial position, and no impact on your annual surplus. And then the last item is just the other items we look at. There are a couple of other differences that were identified. One related to accounts payable, which was understated, but again, it's a prior year, so it has very minimal impact on your annual surplus. And all other differences that were identified were corrected by management on the financial statements. I'll just note as well there's one minor change to the financial statements as a result of our ongoing procedures. It's the interest payable information that's included in Note 11C of the financial statements, which is approximately, it states that they're netting the $191 million of interest, and that's not actually the case. There's no netting going on with respect to that, so there's about four words that will be removed from that note because they shouldn't actually be there. So that's the only adjustment that we've identified as a result of our ongoing procedures.
Thank you very much for your report. Any questions on the second, Councillor Wilkinson? None out.
Yeah. Thank you for this. When I'm reading this and even look at your whole report, it looks like you don't have any major concerns with anything with handling within the way that the reporting of the finances of the city are going.
I think our conclusion is that we believe the financial statements are fairly stated in all material respects in accordance with public sector accounting standards. So.
And the ones that you say are understated or overstated a bit mostly from the past, those have been corrected now so that won't show up in the future, or are they going to be running through?
Some will continue on in the future because the city hasn't actually recorded the amount. So, for example, the indexation on the City of Ottawa Superannuation Fund, the city's not recording that liability, and I don't believe they're intending to going forward. So that one, until that indexation no longer exists, when the fund, because that is a legacy pension plan, when that is no longer around, then that will disappear unless the liability is recorded on the financial statements at some point in time.
Somewhere along the line, we also have to let people, when we're talking about a surplus here, it's not a surplus of money that can be used to reduce their taxes. Because it's not that kind of financial auditing. It has all the valuations of things in it. I've found in the past that people get confused by that. Same thing with Hydro Ottawa. They think that we should be paying them back, but they don't realize it's not quite that way because the way statements are done.
Yeah, it's on an accrual basis. It's not a cash basis.
Yeah.
It's not the same basis as the budget.
But the average person doesn't know that. So I just think when we put the things out, we should let people know that for sure, because we do. Every time it's published, we get those questions. At least I do. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkinson. Vice Chair Cloutier.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Chair Hubley. If Councillor El Chantier can ask the same question every year, I can ask the same question every year. As a result of your work, was there any change in your audit emphasis that you had elaborated at the beginning of your engagement? Any other issues that came forward that caused you to change your emphasis or your procedures, or that might impact your engagement in the future?
No, I can say that we followed our audit plan. We were able to rely on the controls we expected to rely on, which was good. The controls were found to be effective in all areas where we tested, and our areas of audit emphasis are in line with what we have said at the audit plan time.
Any other elements of risk for the city, for the financial recording and reporting of the city that you see in the future?
I think the city is always entering into some fairly complex agreements, and so that's where we see our areas of audit emphasis, understanding those new transactions, how, phase 2 gets penned and what impact that may have on financial statements. So I would say that's where we focus our primary audit efforts. So our primary audit efforts are around those areas where you've got complex transactions, potentially public-private partnerships, etc., where even PSAS, so the accounting board, is still looking at accounting standards in those areas, so it's evolving, and so those are the areas where we see risk and we put focus. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Cloutier. No other questions? Okay. Did you want to? No? You're good? Okay. Thank you both for your presentations. Appreciate it. So is this item carried? And before you answer, please note that the changes will be identified by way of a motion for consideration at the council meeting of June 27. So motion carried? Thank you. Okay, now moving on to the Office of the Auditor General report on audit follow-ups and related reports. The Audit Committee will recommend to Council that we receive the report of the audit follow-ups, detailed audit follow-up reports, receive and approve the recommendations and review of the source-separated organics program business case, and finally receive and approve the recommendations and the follow-up to the 2011 audit of contract management practices, Spring Hill landfill site contract, and additional 2018 audit procedures. Welcome, Auditor General Hughes, and please proceed whenever you're ready with your presentation.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président, membres du comité, conseillers et conseillères. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the Audit Committee, and councillors. Je suis ici avec tous les employés de le bureau de le vérificateur général. À mon gauche, adjoint administratif pour m'assister avec la présentation, Inès Santoro, et les deux vérificateurs généraux adjoints, Sonia Brandon et Louise Prou, et Ed Miner, et les autres employés de le bureau sont en arrière de nous. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've come with all of the staff of the office who have worked on these projects, and I'm sitting here with the Deputy Auditors, Auditor Generals, who will also help me with the presentation. Dans le processus de vérification, le Bureau de vérificateur général respecte les pratiques exemplaires. The Auditor General, in conducting our audits, follows best practices, and we follow the best practices of the Institute of Internal Auditors, and our own City of Ottawa audit standards. On peut voir sur le texte souligné les normes principales de l'Institut de vérificateur interne, et il dit que les vérificateurs doivent instituer un processus de suivi afin de surveiller et d'assurer que les mesures adoptées par la direction ont été mises en œuvre efficacement. Et les processus de vérification par la Ville d'Ottawa sont approuvés par le Conseil en juin 2012. The Institute of Internal Auditors is one of the governing bodies that guides the activities of auditors worldwide. You'll see in the bold text here, we've got a little extract from the audit standards. They indicate that auditors must establish a follow-up process to monitor and ensure that management actions have been effectively implemented. And our job is to ensure that the changes that were recommended and accepted by management and approved by council were implemented. The procedures, the audit procedures and standards of the City of Ottawa were approved by council in June of 2012. And in this next slide, I draw your attention to the highlighted text where it indicates that the Auditor General shall establish such protocols and procedures that are necessary for the conduct of such audits consistent with the City of Ottawa audit standards. and a reminder that once again those audit standards approved by Council are based on the audit standards developed by the Institute of Internal Auditors. Le processus de vérification comporte 4 phases. Nous sommes ici pour la phase de suivi, qui est la dernière phase dans le processus de vérification. The Audit Committee will remember that the audit process has 4 phases. The initial phase, where we identify the risks in the area that we're going to be looking at, is the planning phase. The second phase is the fieldwork phase, and that's where we actually do all of the work and gather all of the evidence that we use to prepare the reports, which leads us to the third phase, which is the reporting phase, where we debrief the management in the area under audit, and we prepare a report which is eventually brought back to the Audit Committee in our annual report, generally in November of each year. And finally, the follow-up phase, and that's why we're here today. We conduct follow-ups on all audits about 2 to 3 years after our audits are completed. And we do that because we're giving management ample time to implement the recommendations that come out of the audit reports. I want the Audit Committee to remember that there's a contract that's developed through this process. We provide a report to the Audit Committee. Management agrees with those recommendations. The Audit Committee then sends these reports to Council where they are approved, and at that point there's a contract between management and Council to make good on the recommendations that come out of the audit reports. Les raisons pour les vérifications sont d'améliorer les pratiques de gestion, mais le suivi de vérification permet de faire le point sur le progrès accompli par la direction. Audits themselves are meant to improve management practices and identify possible economies. The follow-up, however, really identifies management's progress on the resolution to the problems that were identified in the audit reports. Now, today we're providing an overview, and in the documentation that we've provided, there's a high-level executive summary on the audits. And should any member of Council wish to have a more detailed discussion of a specific follow-up or specific audit, certainly we are available to provide that. Aujourd'hui, nous avons 11 suivis de vérification. Today we've got 11 audit follow-ups. But there's one thing that's a little different about this year, and I draw your attention to the last item, and that is that in addition to providing a follow-up to the 2011 audit of contract management at the Spring Hill landfill site, we also performed additional audit procedures, and we'll talk to you about that later. I can confirm that management continues to be committed to the audit process, and that they have generally addressed issues raised by our audits. Cette diapositive indique les résultats de suivi de vérification, et le Bureau de vérification générale a évalué l'application des recommandations dans 6 catégories. Et je peux dire que, on peut voir sur le diapositive que 68% ou 75 sur 110 des recommandations sont appliquées dans les suivis inclus. We assess the results of our follow-ups with 6 categories, and the categories range from complete, which is obviously what everyone wishes to see, through to partially complete, not started. In some instances, we're not able to make an assessment at all, and sometimes because of changes, the recommendations are no longer applicable, and in other cases, we identify issues that we will add to a future audit. So, Mr. Chair, as we turn to the specific follow-ups themselves, I can tell you that these first 4 audits demonstrated good progress. 35 of the 44 recommendations were fully implemented, and we have no specific comments to make on those audits. I'd like to turn it over now to Deputy Auditor General Ed Miner, who will begin with the follow-up on infrastructure services.
Thank you. We followed up on 4 audits and 1 independent review that were all related in that they dealt primarily with infrastructure services branch. Formerly, it used to be a department, so it used to be ISD, so it's either ISB or ISD. I want to point out that the independent review of the Airport Parkway pedestrian and cycling bridge was not conducted by the OAG. However, in 2014, FEDCO asked us to follow up on the recommendations that were made in that report. All told, there were 49 recommendations made related to ISD, and in the 4 audits and the one review, and we found that 31 of these, or 63%, were fully implemented. We also assessed 17 recommendations, or 35%, as being partially implemented. Only partially implementing roughly a third of the recommendations could suggest a lack of sufficient attention to these recommendations. However, we want to stress that was not the case here. ISB has brought in a new project management approach, and with that new software to support their project management approach, and we recognize that that's a significant undertaking. The new project management system, which they refer to as Vision, was not yet implemented in March 2018 when we conducted our follow-up. This resulted in a lot of the recommendations being assessed as partially implemented. We needed to see that the system was actually functioning as intended before we could confirm that the recommendations had been fully implemented. Since then, the system has gone online, and we expect that most of the partially completed recommendations will be fully implemented once the Vision system becomes fully operational. I would ask the Chair if there are any questions on either the 4 previous follow-ups or any of the ISD-related follow-ups.
Does anybody have any questions on the infrastructure services or the follow-ups? I'll just ask you one question on that. The follow-up to the specific areas, the ISD says that you've reached out to 5 municipalities to see what the prices are that they're paying for asphalt. And what have you seen so far from them? Are we paying more or about the same?
Mr. Chair, I think that's probably best answered by management. Okay.
Alan, it's coming down.
Mr. Chair, we're still in the process of conducting that review, but the information that we've seen to date is basically that the prices that we're getting are competitive with the market.
So how many municipalities have responded so far?
I believe that so far we had 2 that formally responded, and we're still waiting for the responses from 2 or 3. The challenge that we get with reaching out to other municipalities is not, and I think the auditor also faced some of the same challenges, is a lot of municipalities are very reluctant to provide prices because they all go through the competitive pricing environment. So getting information is not that easy. But the information that we've certainly been able to draw from different resources certainly point to the fact that we are getting competitive prices for the material that we're receiving.
I would hope we could get some more, so what I'm going to ask if we can do it, as you continue your efforts, would it be possible that the Auditor General's Office could reach out to your counterparts in other municipalities and see if they have any of that information that we could work with staff and come up with some sort of a comparison on what we're doing for costs and so on with asphalt?
Mr. Chair, we can certainly do that.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Did you want to move on to the next audit? Thank you, Ellen.
We followed up on the 10 recommendations that were made in the audit of procurement practices related to source-separated organics contract with Orga World. We found solid progress as we assessed that 9 out of the 10 recommendations had been fully implemented. The committee will recall that in 2014, the committee provided direction to the Auditor General to review management's analysis of the potential changes to the Oil World contract. And committee will also recall that we provided a verbal debriefing on this work to the Environment and Climate Protection Committee roughly 2.5 months ago on March 26th. At that meeting, we promised that our report was to follow, and our written report on this work is included here today. Without getting all the details, our work does support management's decision to recommend the renegotiated Oil World contract. That has not changed. We did want to note that our work assumes that the city will change its green bin program to add the plastic bags and the dog waste when the Oil World facility is ready to accept them. And this is important, that the city has to coordinate its transition to the changes in the program to the modifications at the Oil World facility in order to avoid paying higher processing fees to process what we currently put in the green bin, because the rates are going to change when they're ready to take on the new material, regardless if the city is changing. So we just want to make sure that they make that change. We identified 3 areas for improvement in our review, and making 3 recommendations, and management has agreed with all of them. And I would just ask the chair if there are any questions on either this SSO follow-up or on the work we did on the business case.
Councillor Carter.
Thank you very much. You said that one condition was not followed as of yet with staff out of the recommendations. Do we know what that condition is that is not followed so far?
Yes, in the original audit, we had asked that they can assess the marginal cost of separating out the leaf and yard waste collection and processing it separately. And that information was not actually included in the business case, and we had expected that to be included in there. The analysis was done, and we reviewed it, and it was not cost efficient based on what we saw to make that change, but we would have expected that information been fully disclosed and brought out in the business case that they brought to council. That was the one item that was not fully implemented.
And was there a recommendation from staff as to why the process didn't go forward with that one recommendation?
Without speaking too much on staff's behalf, what we got basically was it was so clear that they didn't bother. Basically the collection costs are really what the very significant costs in the process, and that the change in collection costs would more than offset any change in processing. And so in their mind it was so obvious it didn't have to be brought forward. In our view, it should have been brought forward anyway.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, as time goes on and as the various collection contracts open up, it would be beneficial for staff to continue to address that issue from time to time when they have an opportunity to make changes as the various contracts open up in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Auditor General. Councillor Clute.
Thank you, Chair Hoodley. I guess this question might be to management. Recommendation number 1 is that the city continually challenge the consultant's statements and assumptions, and we've seen this before. It speaks to contract management, and the response to the recommendation is yes. But can we? What specific steps from management are we doing to make sure that we are challenging those assumptions and ensuring the good administration of our contracts?
Chair, management is following the best practices of contract management now as set out by supply services, so I think that's a good step forward. Also, We do rely on the expertise, in this case, of qualified engineers, and in future we'll keep a more regular oversight, specifically from not just the project manager, and I think the auditor did find that the project manager had a fairly good oversight of the modeling that the consultant was doing, but more of senior management to make sure that we have better oversight of the work that's being done at the project management level.
It speaks to the work undertaken by Dylan. Can you tell us a little bit more about what their involvement will be, and specifically to this contract, the source separated organics, or is it generally across project management in the city?
Chair, the work from Dylan on this project is completed now. It was an evaluation of tonnages going forward in the future. I will say over that piece, we did do a sensitivity analysis requested by the Auditor General, and that even found that the conclusions that we reached to renegotiate the contract was the right option going forward.
My final comment related to that question is simply I hope that the city receives that recommendation not only for this contract, but generally with consultants, and that we examine, that we challenge to ensure that moving forward on every project we are as efficient and effective as possible.
Yes, Chair, and I think that is the crux of the guidelines as set out by supply management.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Cloutier. I just have to make an observation here that this is a follow-up to the audit of the separated organics contract that I think most councillors would agree that original audit generated the most letters and comments from residents in our wards, and it's kudos to the Auditor General and his team for really taking the lid off that garbage can and coming up with a lot of good recommendations, and kudos to Mr. Wiley and Mr. Kanalakis for city staff's effort to bring us to the point where I hope I don't jinx you guys with this comment, but I doubt that this is going to be the leading story on the news tonight. That's how far we've come with this, and I think most people, from what I'm hearing in the community, really like the recommendations and the way forward that you've worked out leading out of this audit. So I want to thank everybody involved for that. Okay, that said, I got that off my chest. Go ahead.
Nous n'avons pas déposé le rapport sur la vérification menée à l'origine en 2011 en ce qui concerne les pratiques de gestion de contrats pour les échanges Spring Hill en raison de l'arbitrage. The Audit Committee will recall that the original 2011 audit of contract management practices for the Spring Hill landfill was not tabled by the Auditor General because of the arbitration. Given that a considerable amount of time has passed since the original audit, in addition to following up to the 2011 audit recommendations, we performed additional audit procedures in 2017 and 2018 to bring the audit up to date. These procedures included an assessment of whether the city has been effectively and efficiently managing the Spring Hill landfill site agreement to date, and an examination of the financial impact of the environmental contamination, closure, and post-closure costs on the city. I'd now like to turn the mic over to Deputy Auditor General Sonia Brennan.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and Committee. I'll start with a quick overview of the timeline. As you can see, it's over 20 years, so there are a number of key points that we wanted to remind, refresh, inform. Then we will discuss I'll review the original audit findings and those recommendations, and then we will review the current work that we did, the additional audit procedures we did to bring everything up to date. Following that, there will be the in-camera portion where we were unable to discuss the details of the arbitration agreement because of the confidentiality order. So as you know, the Spring Hill landfill is a 100-acre landfill site located within the geographic area of the former township of Osgood. This was a public-private partnership agreement that was entered into by the former township of Osgood and Tomlinson. This was done in 1996, predated amalgamation, which, as you know, took place in 2001. Just to review some key terms of the agreement. This agreement between the two parties was effective until the landfill reaches its capacity. The city can dump all residual waste sourced in the geographic area of the former township of Osgood free of charge. Tomlinson, as the manager, can set dumping fees in its discretion at prevailing rates. They are also responsible for all policy decisions related to daily operations. In 2000, there was an amendment to this agreement. The key aspect of this amendment I want to bring to your attention is that it allowed for an additional financial credit to Tomlinson depending on total tonnage received from municipal collection. The city has received 40% of net profits as a royalty payment. And the other key element of the agreement I want to bring to your attention is a project reserve fund. In the agreement, it states that the fund was to reach a total of $1 million at the end of 30 years. It was funded on an annual schedule and is still being done so by Tomlinson. Subsequently, in 1998, a lease was entered into between the former township of Osgood and Tomlinson, and this allowed Tomlinson to operate a construction and demolition waste recycling facility on the landfill site. The expiry date of the lease is 2018, later this year. The lease had no cost to it, so there was no monies received by the city for this lease. Again, this agreement was also inherited by the City of Ottawa upon amalgamation. The lease essentially outlines the respective rights of each party while the facility is operating. The Cnd facility collects, processes, and recycles construction materials. It's a 20-term lease. It can be terminated earlier if the overall agreement is terminated before that time. Any residual waste or unrecyclable material that the facility produces is disposed of in the landfill at no additional cost. And then the final term of the agreement I would like to note is that in that agreement, Tomlinson, the tenant, agrees not to conduct any activity that may constitute damage to the lands or the premises or breach any regulations. Relations between the city and Tomlinson have been difficult since amalgamation. This led to an arbitration process that took place in 2009. The arbitration was completed in 2010. A payment was not agreed upon until 2016, and the city received payment last month. So that was 2 years after the agreement to the fees. Next slide. The original audit found that over the length of the agreement, as I previously noted, there had been numerous disputes with Tomlinson. The city needed more information in order to fully understand the landfill operations and to reconcile its annual royalty payments. The agreement did stipulate that accounting records and this information was to be provided to the city. Select information has been provided by Tomlinson, such as audited financial statements, but a significant number of requirements have not been met over the years. City staff has not been presented with sufficient information to assess the operations and therefore have never been able to determine the adequacy of the royalty payments. The original audit also found that the city needed to be more proactive in contract oversight and monitor Tomlinson's compliance with the management agreement. We found the same issue with respect to contract oversight in our updated work. I would like to note that we did notice an improvement in contract oversight, which began in 2014. 4 recommendations were made in the original report. These were related to acting upon the arbitration outcomes, updating council with information, or improving contract oversight and dispute management. All 4 recommendations were assessed to be partially completed. So as we noted earlier, we performed additional procedures to bring this information up to date to look at the interim period since 2011 in terms of the contract oversight. So we assessed how the city was managing the contract. We also assessed the financial impact of the environmental contamination, which I'll talk about further, as well as the closure and post-closure costs to the city. Next slide. With respect to the areas of governance and contract management that we looked at, we found that there's been a high turnover of staff on this project. In addition, during periods of staff transition, we found there was poor handover of files and information from person to person. In our report, we state that when we requested meeting minutes and copies of notes kept by contract managers for their dealings with Tomlinson during the period of 2010 to 2014, none could be provided. The committee should know that a few days ago, to their credit, management told us that they have found some files from this period. This example demonstrates the importance of ensuring that all files and documentation and information, especially for contract management, that they are adequately handed over when key staff transitions occur. Especially concerning with respect to poor documentation practices and record keeping, and the ability to find the files and ensure that they're handed over and transitioned. This is especially concerning given the environment of when you have years of difficulties and disputes with your partner. I think anyone, certainly in the legal profession and otherwise, would agree that it is far more important in those circumstances than any other that you keep very detailed records of interactions, of requests for information, and whether or not your partner is complying to the agreement. This highlights the importance of ensuring that the city has strong contract management policies and procedures to guide and support management in their work. Difficulties in obtaining information from Tomlinson has been an ongoing theme throughout the life of this arrangement. Despite efforts made by the program coordinator, by finance staff, and numerous city requests for information, they have largely gone unanswered by Tomlinson, or select information would be provided that was insufficient for the type of analysis and assurance that management was trying to obtain. We believe that more senior management involvement and engagement and legal involvement earlier may have compelled Tomlinson to provide the city with the information needed to manage this contract effectively. This was also recommended in the original audit in 2011. Overall, the way the agreement was structured, this gave Tomlinson full control over the day-to-day operations and policy decisions. This led to Tomlinson making decisions about Spring Hill without having to consult the city. Often these decisions benefited Tomlinson-related companies. However, once the landfill capacity is exhausted, the city assumes all these risks and costs of any post-closure activities. We examined royalty payments. Over the last 21 years, the city has received a little over $6 million in royalty payments, about $300,000 a year. When we consider the expenses the city has incurred over this period of time, in our opinion, the costs far exceed the royalty payments. The other element that was very evident for us was the concerns around the costs. So there were chargeable and non-chargeable costs outlined in the agreement that could be deducted to determine net income, which impacts the royalty the city receives. The city has literally never received enough information to determine whether costs that should not be charged were not. This information was just not provided, and that's still an unknown. In 2015, more than 50,000 tons of C&D facility waste was deposited in the landfill for free. And again, this is allowed because of the way the agreement is structured. Although the agreement itself restricts the service area of the landfill to the former township of Osgood, any material that's received by the C&D facility, that regional area is extended to all of Eastern Ontario as well as the Outaouais region. Any of the material that goes through that facility can then be deposited into the landfill. In addition to filling up the landfill at a faster rate than originally anticipated, the city is not receiving any revenue for this waste. It is also interesting to note that 76% of the total materials received at the C&D facility came from Tomlinson-related companies. When we looked at the fees that were being charged from the years 2015 to 2017, at times these fees were discounted as much as 28 to 38%. And these were the fees that were charged to Tomlinson-related companies as compared to non-related parties. Overall, Tomlinson's related parties are benefiting from disposing of C&D materials at preferential rates while having the Spring Hill landfill accept the residual waste at no charge and thereby having the city share in all the related costs. With respect to insurance, the agreement has a requirement for insurance. The detailed requirements of what the insurance was required to cover and the terms of that insurance are referred to in the agreement under a separate schedule, Schedule E. We were never able to receive a copy of Schedule E. It can't be found. Up until this time, as far as we know, it still cannot be found. So the city is unaware of whether or not, over the course of the agreement, that insurance was purchased by Tomlinson and would have been in compliance with the original agreement. We did request to receive a certificate of insurance from Tomlinson during the course of our audit. There is a section in this that indicates there's a pollution liability. We requested a copy of the policy, but to date we still have not been provided with a copy of the actual insurance policy. Over the course of the agreement, we find that the insurance was not monitored or received in terms of records that the city had requested from Tomlinson. Another point to note in terms of the capacity of the landfill, as of the end of 2017, it's approximately 75% filled. There was an unforeseen impact of a 20-ton daily limit of approximately 62,000 tons a year, which was far beyond the projected original capacity of 7,400 tons per year from the former township of Osgood. This, combined with the operation of the C&D facility, is leading to a fill rate of approximately 7 times that was what was originally forecasted for this site. There were significant issues of environmental contamination identified by the Ministry of the Environment of Ontario. They identified significant groundwater and surface water issues. They described it as one of the worst in Eastern Ontario. This environmental contamination is impacting provincially significant wetland that surrounds the landfill. Specifically, leachate impacting groundwater is migrating from the landfill to neighboring properties and interacting with surface water outside of the landfill. The city is the owner of the landfill ECA. It's the environmental compliance approval that's received by the ministry. Was required to come up with a medium to long-term plan for environmental remediation. The city submitted an action plan, which has been accepted in draft and in principle by the ministry, and they are required to come back in August later this year with a more detailed plan for the ministry to receive and approve. The estimated capital cost for the plan is approximately $7 to $8 million. This does not include any ongoing operating costs, which would extend for a considerable amount of years. That information is being worked on by engineering consultants and will be as we understand, will be further determined later this year. Tomlinson had proposed, at that time they were not in agreement with the city's plan. They had proposed an alternative plan to implement a purge well system to move the contaminated groundwater away from the wetland and onto surrounding property owned by Tomlinson. They would have then proposed that the city purchase this land from Tomlinson as they own those properties adjacent to the landfill. The city had stated at that time that it did not have an interest in that plan. While the city's plan requires a larger upfront capital cost, future operating costs would be lower, and it's also a better solution for the environment. In contrast, the original proposed plan by Tomlinson requires a smaller upfront capital investment, but requires much higher future operating costs that would be borne entirely by the city once the landfill is closed. Once the city's plan is approved by the ministry later this year, the next step will be to determine who will pay for those costs. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to draw the attention of the Audit Committee to recommendation number 8 from this report. I can tell you that it is not a recommendation that we developed without a lot of thought. It's not a step that we took lightly. The relationship between the contractor and the city, was so troubled with requests for information going unanswered for many, many years. We are recommending that the city evaluate under the procurement bylaw whether Tomlinson is a good business partner for this project and for future endeavors. And I assure you that a lot of thought was put into this recommendation because of its seriousness. Now, we understand that within the last 48 hours, there's been some discussions between Tomlinson and the city, and that's important and that's reassuring. But nevertheless, we in light of those discussions, we believe the city should move quickly to resolve the problems with this relationship while continuing to consider whether Tomlinson is a good business partner for this project and for future endeavors. Now, to finish, management agreed with all 16 recommendations that were in this report. And before going on camera, I would ask the chair if there's any questions concerning either the Spring Hill follow-up or the additional audit procedures that we conducted.
Thank you, Mr. Auditor General. We're going to go to the delegations, public delegations, before we go to questions, if that's okay, because there's just one registered. I just would like to follow up on what you just said about recent developments and so on. I think it's important that we put on the record here before we get into this that the city, as you outlined in your audit, that the city inherited this agreement for the operation of the Spring Hill landfill from the former Osgood Township municipal amalgamation. It's also important to note that the city acknowledges the agreement with Tomlinson Waste Management to operate the landfill has not been beneficial to the environment or to taxpayers. And we know that, as you've touched on here, that the city management has worked for years to resolve the differences with Tomlinson through extensive discussions and legal arbitration. In order to improve the working relationship between the two parties and before we tabled the actual audit, I also spoke to the city manager and the president of the Tomlinson group of companies and asked that they get together on the management of the site with the goal of protecting the taxpayer. And that, I believe, let's just say these discussions have been fruitful. Tomlinson has agreed to fully cooperate in addressing the environmental conditions at the landfill, which includes assuming responsibility for remedial work required as part of the long-term remedial action plan. Now, while we will now, just before we go into asking these tough questions on the audit and the findings, I also want to acknowledge and thank you, the Auditor General, for your work on this and your team. and I believe it's one of the best audits that has come out of your shop yet, and for the benefit of taxpayers. I think it's also important that we acknowledge the General Manager, Kevin Wiley's efforts, as well as City Manager Steve Kanalakis, for their efforts to resolve this matter in the interest of taxpayers. So thank you. Now, if I could call Bill Toms up, he can come and speak to the audit. And then we'll go into questions. No, he's not presenting. He's just got questions.
Mr. Chair, it takes quite a bit to get a grumpy old economist out of this house early in the morning and take OC Transpo to come here. But when I knew that Mr. Hughes was going to be here, I couldn't miss it. And I've really been kind of interested in this Spring Hill issue for a long time. Tried to get information on it, stonewalled at every step by for various reasons, many of them quite legitimate. And I must commend Mr. Hughes for all of his work, his staff's work on this. But if I'm shaking, it's not because I'm nervous. I'm just so shocked to hear all of the details today. It is just really quite amazing. And I have a defibrillator here, so if I drop over on the floor, it's because I'm still so excited about hearing all of these things. I guess I had a lot of questions, but it's really, looking back at this, it has taken a long time. And there was a report issued back in the early days, authored by Moira Winch, and she used to work for the town of Osgood, and she laid out practically the nub of all of the problems back at that time. It was crystal clear how bad this was. And then when the city took over, everything kind of went quiet. And now we know that the quietness was caused by the fact that there really wasn't very much good oversight that took place. I was particularly puzzled about some of the numbers, because it seemed to me that if the city had actually been able to act and sell this useless asset, because it had nothing to do with the city's waste management priorities, the city is not involved in C&D, if that asset had been put up for auction and sold, we would have made money. We would have been able to sell the asset for something, okay? And then at least we would have collected some property taxes, municipal property taxes, because we've received nothing from that. I suspect we would be better off had we collected municipal property taxes from a third-party owner. In any case, I don't want to get into the legalities of why we're now going to exclude the public from any information, but it just seems like as if this is a really, really important issue which needs to be given some more airing. I'm also a little bit surprised that all of this is now a lot of the details are not going to be released. And I wondered whether or not this is consistent with the Municipal Freedom of Information Act, that if people actually ask for some things, because it seems like a lot of the details that were in arbitration and under the order that was agreed to, put out by Justice Mativier, that surely that type of information, so long as it was not commercially confidential, should be released to the public, so that now we have a bit more of information than what was already available. So I guess my bottom line is I'm really appreciate that someone has taken this whole matter quite seriously, and I'm glad that the committee is looking at it, but I think more work needs to be done, particularly on issues relating to the environmental liability. If we look at that $1 million fund, it's pretty obvious that the money that has been set aside is nowhere near enough to fix the problem, and it seems unreasonable that the city would then end up footing the bill for things that have happened at that site that probably shouldn't have happened. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toms. I think Councillor Wilkinson has a question for you, but I just first want to acknowledge and thank you for acknowledging that this is transparency at its best for the taxpayer and at the worst for the city. These are things that nobody likes to put on the table, but thanks to the Auditor General and the function of the audit, we are very transparent. We show all our warts and here's our problems, but what I tend to focus on, and I hope you will as well, is the recommendations that come out of the audit and the steps that city management has already taken based on this audit to rectify all those issues that you talked about. So, Councillor Wilkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bill, I know Moira Works very well. So you mentioned her report, which was, I guess, pre-amalgamation? And who was it done for, do you know?
It was, I can actually give you a copy.
I can talk to Moira about it.
Okay. It's called Private and Public Partnerships, and it says, can small municipalities participate? And I was very, very impressed with the quality of what she did. It went and was released in a journal called PCED, and she goes into considerable detail on exactly some of the problems, and I can just go for a minute.
Does that include this specific project?
Oh, absolutely. It goes into great detail on this particular project, and some of the comments that she made were to the effect the way in which the relationship developed between Tomlinson and the city, the previous city, but certainly the city of Ottawa, in terms of asking for things from the city. If you look at the arbitration, that one of the key items seemed to be asking the city to support the expansion of the landfill site. That's rather like a tenant coming to you and telling you as owner, we want you to add 3 extra bedrooms onto this house that I'm currently renting. That's a bit above and beyond what people normally expect between a tenant and a landlord.
Okay. So, just to go, while you're still there, do you have a copy of this report at all, or have you seen it?
Yes, we do, and we've seen it, we read it, and it was informative. It was very informative for us when we conducted the audit.
I think it would be useful for the committee to actually see it, to get a sort of a better understanding of the whole history behind this. I know it's history, and we have to look at what we have today and try to fix up, but knowing that may help to inform us on things as well. So I don't know if you could send a copy, or Mr. Bill, if you could send an electronic copy, would be the best.
I think we can do that. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for bringing that forward, because I think it's important to know, we have to know where this started.
Yeah.
But we also have to then know how, and we can see all the problems over the years, but how we're going to deal with it now. I think that's what the Chair and the Auditor General, I do know particularly. Thank you.
I think there's an old expression about things ill began, ne'er end well, and this is clearly something that started in kind of a crisis situation in the town of Osgood, and then the contract was set up and run and took a couple of years. I searched the City of Ottawa website for background material on Osgood, and it was away in the archives. Couldn't find it anywhere on the website, so I had to go to the archives. And I guess one of the things that I found most interesting is that there was a lot of handwritten stuff in pencil on the original council minutes about how the payments were going to be calculated. And it seemed to have taken about 2 or 3 years before anybody actually even specified a sample calculation of how the city's revenues were going to be calculated. So it certainly was a bit of a haphazard job that was put together, and the city inherited that problem and just tried to do their best with it. And now the fruits have come home.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkinson. Thank you, Mr. Toms. Sorry, if you could just stay one more minute. Councillor Aguilar has a question for you as well.
Well, it's a comment and a question. So first of all, Bill, I certainly don't consider you to be a grumpy old economist. I consider you to be quite an engaged Ward 9 resident on this issue, and I know that you've had interactions with the city manager's office, city solicitor, city auditor. I'm just found out about the archives. So in part, you're one of the people that have sort of kept everybody's feet to the fire on this issue. So I want to thank you for that. Your engagement on this, and you're not allowed to ask questions, but you raised a question. I'm looking at legal as I make this comment, and maybe legal at some point could comment on this, but Mr. Toms raised the issue of going forward what can and cannot be released under the Act in relation to the further information we're going to get. I don't know, Mr. Chair, if it's appropriate time to comment on that now while Mr. Toms is still in the room and can get that answer, or if you want to hold that.
Mr. Chair, certainly aware of the inquiries from Mr. Toms, and we've discussed this. As you may know, the original arbitration award was marked confidential by the arbitrator in order to protect the commercial information of third parties that gave evidence. Immediately after the award, the city pursued having that confidentiality marking removed. The arbitrator declined. The city continues to this day to pursue having that order vacated. And we heard, frankly, as late as last week from the arbitrator that to date he's kind of recused himself from that process and will pursue that through whatever means, whether it be another arbitrator or potentially a court application.
Thank you for that clarification. I hope that helps answer your question.
Thank you, Councillor Agwai. Councillor DeRose.
Thank you. I want to comment. Thank you very much, Mr. Toms, and I know that you gave me lots of background on this inherited issue a file that I received, and I know you emailed my office multiple times, and I hope today you got your answers, and thank you for you being patient with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thank you, Councillor Drews. So we'll go to questions now for staff or for the Auditor General. Councillor Elson-Turi, and then followed by Councillor DeRuse and Councillor Wilkinson.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the Auditor General. First of all, thank you for bringing this file forward. We've only been asking for since 2007. That's the record, because that's the time when the landfill in Carp started getting some media attention. So we went to visit this site and we asked staff at the time some question, and it took us only 11 years to get them, and it's no fault of you or anyone. Unfortunately, this is one of, we just heard from legal, the confidentiality of the arbitration in this file, but we are here today. And I'm not sure how to describe, even in the previous township of Osgood, will do a contract really skewed toward the benefit of the company against the taxpayer. To the life of me, I cannot digest this. It's almost like the one thing was missing, giving candy with that contract. And maybe the township should have offered candy and lemonade after they signed a stupid contract like this. But nevertheless, it's been signed, it's been done. What I have a problem with, a few years ago, we came here on FEDCO committee, and we talked to staff, and we asked staff, if a company is not compliant with the city and they leave jobs unfinished behind, what is the consequences of that? And I do believe at the time was Councillor Blowas who put this motion on the floor. And I would like legal to make a comment about this. What is the policy on company did not fulfill their commitment when they have contract with the city?
Mr. Chair, the procurement bylaw contains two provisions. You saw them referenced in the Auditor General's report. One of them allows the city, based on the prior performance of the contractor, to essentially ban them from doing business for a period of time. And that would involve an assessment by the Chief Procurement Officer in consultation with the City Clerk and Solicitor of their overall performance. There is also provision, and this may be what the councilor is referring to an additional clause which allows the city to reject an individual bid of a proponent on a go-forward basis based on it's what's called the litigation exclusion, where certainly the past history with the contractor demonstrates that the actual cost of doing business with them may be inflated by the virtue of the fact that the city is going to have to be involved in litigation with them. So you have one piece that deals with past performance, and you have another that deals with involvement in litigation. One addresses essentially all bids. The litigation exclusion applies to an individual bid on a prospective basis.
At the risk not to go through numbers, because we're going to wait till we go in camera, my question to you, Mr. White, through the chair, have the chief procurement officer ever pulled that card against that company, since that company has not complied with the city according to our audit here in the last 8 years? So in the last 8 years, has that company still doing business as usual with the city? Yes or no would be great.
And Mr. Chair, I will not be able to give a yes or no, but the chief procurement officer is coming down to speak to that very issue right now.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, the Tomlinson Group of companies have a number of contracts with the city and overall have a very strong performance record. On this contract, most recently they have begun cooperating, and our expectation is they will continue to cooperate. Any additional action that's required under these provisions of the bylaw will be based on the assessment of their ongoing success.
Were you informed by the city staff in the last 8 years Tomlinson has not paid the city a dime and has not cooperated? Have you been informed about this?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Most recently, I have been engaged on this file to address their ongoing performance.
And why took you 8 years to get engaged on this?
Excuse me, sir?
Why took 8 years to get engaged about this? Because in the last 8 years, we haven't received any cooperation, according to the report, from Tomlinson. What it took you the 8 years to comply, or at least force them to comply? Or if you want to wait till we go on camera, because there's a lot of questions here. I think the public need to know this.
Mr. Chair, I think if I can categorize it, we were in arbitration up till about 2016. So we were fighting on that front and trying to get royalty payments, etc., and financial details through the arbitration process. As you heard from the Auditor General, his findings were the contract was well managed since 2014 under the current contract manager and director. And really, despite repeated requests for this type of information, I think we exhausted all avenues, and going to the chief procurement officer and the city treasurer based on the broader procurement that Tomlinson does with the city was really the last resort, and we did enact that this year, and it has gotten some results from Tomlinson finally. So I think that's kind of the linear way things happen. We were really in arbitration, and hopeful that arbitration, and certainly you'll hear from our city solicitor about the arbitration process, hopeful that arbitration would reach a positive conclusion for the city, and it did somewhat.
I'm still, Mr. Chair, and I don't know if legal can help me to understand this. So if in 2016 the final arbitration came out, so that's 2 years ago, and we know Tomlinson Group of Company do a lot of business with the city. I don't know percentage-wise, but I mean they're one of the large company in our city and do business with us. And according to our own bylaw, if a company doesn't comply with the city, we have that tool to ban them from betting on contract. Why was not been activated? That section was just read by Mr. White.
So I could interject to the city solicitor, perhaps to get a clear answer for the council. Maybe this has to go in camera. I'd like to get your view.
This is not in camera information.
No, Mr. Chair, I think this is still in the periphery and still good for public conversation.
Okay.
Well, Mr. Chair, may I interject in this just to
The question is, why was there any inaction, as I'm interpreting the question from the councillor, in terms of when we know that this was going on? Going to Section 37 and 47 of the bylaw.
Sorry, Steve, that's not what my question is. I accept the fact it was arbitration rules until 2016. You cannot do anything before arbitration. Okay, no, but from 2016 till now.
That's what I want to talk about.
Okay, please tell me what have you done.
That's the part I want to answer.
Okay.
There was ongoing discussion with Thomason's. We weren't getting the cooperation, and quite frankly, we should have probably pulled that trigger sooner than later. There was a 2-year period where I think staff, generally, we try to work with companies. Thomason, as you said, is a large company in this community. They do a significant amount of business with the city. As our Chief Procurement Officer states, their work is generally fine. We have one sore spot here with Tomlinson, which is this particular file, and we keep working to try and get resolution. If I was to look at it again from after we settled the arbitration, what happened, we would have went sooner to try and get triggered. I think I would have got involved sooner myself. I was hopeful that we would try to reach some resolution, and we didn't until, quite frankly, the Auditor General got involved in the file, and we saw another path in terms of getting more aggressive with getting the information that we needed. So the answer is yes, we should have, we didn't.
Okay. Mr. Chair, there's a lot of ifs and buts here, but clearly the taxpayer got a bad deal on this from day one. From 96 to 2018, that's 22 years the taxpayer's been on the hook for something really shameful, to say the least, on a contract of this nature. And I understand there's a limit because the city has inherited this file from the former township, but nevertheless, it seems like even we had a tool in the toolbox, and I accept the fact that the explanation from the city manager, but I was hoping to come strong with this, because this is the only tool we have right now in our hand, is companies don't comply in good standard with the city, and even that was not used until now. But I hope this is a lesson learned for all of us, and maybe the question is going to be, if they don't comply with all the cleanup bills we have right now, racking us and contaminated of a wetland, is the city going to take a strong position and ban this company from doing business with us until such a time they cooperate with the city?
Mr. Chair, the company is, Thomason Group of Companies is fully aware of this. They have received a letter from our Chief Procurement Officer, I don't know, several months ago. Will, I'm trying to remember when you sent the letter. It was in May. And the letter clearly stated that this may be invoked should they not start to comply, because we were looking for financial information. They sent us financial information within, I think, 48 hours of receiving that letter. This is still on the table. It's a recommendation of the Auditor General, and we've agreed with the recommendation. We are in discussions with Thomason Group of Companies. I personally met with Mr. Wiley, with the president of Thomason Group of Companies. They fully understand the severity of this situation. They are also, saying, look, this is a file that has not gone well, and that we have a lot of good things going with the city, and I acknowledge that. But they also understand that we have to deal with this, and we have to deal with this and get ourselves back on track in terms of protecting our taxpayers from the environmental issues that have been created there and the potential costs that could flow back to the city. They need to take responsibility for that. They've acknowledged that and have agreed to that verbally, and we're going to continue discussions after, as the chair said. So this here is in the backdrop and in the background of what we can trigger if they don't cooperate. And I've made that very clear with them, that if that's the case, we're moving here. We'll have a big fight with them, I think, legally, but we're not afraid of a fight with anybody, quite frankly. And for us to invoke this would be the measure we take if we don't get cooperation from Thomason Group of Companies on this file right now.
would management report back to us on a result, or that's going to be through the audit, like the final, like through the audit?
There's an audit recommendation that Mr. Hughes has put forward that we report back to council through the various committee structures on our progress on this file, and we will. I mean, I think based on the audit tabling today, we have a responsibility to report back in terms of the outcome of the discussion, because we can't leave this sitting out there in terms of what's happening with the environmental issue, what's happening with all the recommendations. We plan to come back, and I'm sure Mr. Hughes will be doing a follow-up audit at some point also.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Terry, for your questions. Councillor DeRoos. And that'll be Councillor Wilkinson and Councillor Cloutier after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the Audit Committee and their hard work. And I know I inherited this file, and most of you know that the Spring Hill is located in my ward, and I'm very, very interested in it. But to me, is the way I'm looking at it, and I appreciate my council colleagues and the city manager's comment, and I do agree that Tomlinson has been a company that's been doing business with the city and the township in many, many years. So there is a big history and long-time history. And I understand why the city manager and why the city didn't act as of Councillor Chantier was asking. And I realize that there is one contract went wrong. And I cannot blame Tomlinson or the Osgood Township. I'm sitting here on the sideline because I want to protect my community and I want to make sure that environmentally responsible for my resident. And what happened 21 years ago, I cannot tell you, and I was not part of it. But this is my comment right now on this file. It triggered lots of interest in my community, and I want to make sure I am really working hard to dealing with the issue that they've been resurfacing. And I know that I am very confident, and I'm assured by the city staff and by many sources that Tomlinson will be working with us and making sure that to address these issues one after the other. My concern is, on the meantime, what's going on currently and how we are monitoring the surface water and making sure that the residents that they live around the site are not impacted. And that question probably I can direct it to Mr. Wiley.
Chair, Ms. Journeau is coming up. She may be able to flesh out some of the details, but there is active monitoring going on at the site. It has been going on for years by Tomlinson's consultant. We're receiving that information. Since then, you will have received my memo of this morning. There's been no fill activity now for about a month. Tomlinson has started doing their interim cover on the closed cells of the facility, which will start to abate the groundwater. And there's active monitoring in, I believe, 2 drinking wells. One that's not, one's a property that's been assumed by Tomlinson, and there's no resident there. And I believe the other one there is a resident, but we're actively monitoring in 2 drinking wells. And there's been no evidence of any contamination at that point, and we will continue to actively monitor to protect the health of our residents.
Thank you. Madam, can you please give me a little idea how far you go doing test well for the community around the site?
So currently there is an active monitoring program around the landfill site, as Mr. Wiley said. And so most of the monitors are adjacent to the landfill site, and with the exception of those 2 drinking water wells off the landfill footprint itself. There is no indication that there is any evidence of contamination heading towards any of the residential wells along Bank Street or on any of the adjacent concessions. And so the Ministry of the Environment reviews that data from Tomlinson's consultant, and they also agree that there is little likelihood of any contamination being in any residential wells in the area.
On the precaution side, can we expand our monitoring well for the community, like for a bigger or larger geographically area that we do right now?
We would be happy to work with your office and discuss an expanded monitoring program, perhaps going and offering to residents within maybe 700 meters of the landfill site if they would like us to take a sample of their well water. So we'll work with your office directly and come up with a plan.
Thank you. Right. Mr. Chair, will I be able to have a recommendation to staff that to make sure that they keep monitoring and expand the area where we do monitoring around the site to probably 1 kilometer around the site? Is that something we can work with the staff?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, we can look at that, and how about we work with you directly on an appropriate plan on a go-forward basis?
I'm okay with that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Drews. Councillor Wilkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an awful mess, but let's see what we can do with it. Is the lease on this property confidential, or can we get copies of it?
Yes, copies of either agreement would be available.
Yeah, as I was looking at this thing, we've dealt a lot in our area with the CARP landfill, which is privately operated but on their own land. This is privately operated on city land. I think that's the only difference, right? You have to get permits from the Ministry of Environment to operate a landfill. Is that agreement with them or with us? Who has the agreement as an operator?
The agreement to operate is with the ministry and the municipality. Staff can correct me if I'm wrong, but the lease is with Tomlinson. And the agreement for the Cnd demolition facility is with Tomlinson.
So Tomlinson has at least one aspect of the landfill, and this the permit from the province. And we have the permit for the rest?
Mr. Chair, so there are 2 environmental compliance certificates for that landfill, or in that property. One is for the landfill site, which we own the ECA for that landfill. The second ECA is for the C&D facility, and Tomlinson owns that ECA.
And are the problems identified by the ministry for both together, or for ours and not theirs, or theirs and not? How does that go?
So currently the issues are with respect to the landfill's ECA, and the remedial action plan that's in place is to address the issues, the environmental issues at the landfill, which is our ECA.
So that means that although they have a lease to operate the landfill, if they create a problem in doing so with drainage, we have to pay and they don't have to pay?
No, they are required they are responsible for our day-to-day operations at that landfill site. So if they have caused environmental issues or degradation at that landfill, it is our opinion that they are responsible to remediate those issues.
So why are we doing the mitigation plan and not them at their cost? I mean, we seem to be paying a lot of money for the operation of this landfill because of problems created by the landfill, which is their responsibility, is it not?
So as the owner of the environmental compliance certificate, it was the city that submitted the remediation plan to the Ministry of the Environment. And so that plan has been approved in its concept, and we will be putting in a long-term, more detailed plan by the end of the summer to the MOE. That will be for the actual design of the cap and the stormwater management system for that site.
So are we going to charge Tomlinson for the cost of preparing the remedial work to be done on what they've caused as a problem from the landfill?
It is our expectation that we'll work together with them and that they will be responsible for those costs because the problems at the site were caused by their operations. It is our opinion that that is what has happened at that site.
But what about paying for the cost of preparing the plan? That's expensive too.
Yeah, well, at this point, we're just trying to get the plan done. It's got very tight timelines, so the city has already hired a consultant to help us develop that plan. And I guess we can work with Tomlinson on who's going to pay the consultant.
With them, I think perhaps going to the city manager on this in his discussions with them. These are costs directly related to their operation, and doing the plan is directly related to that, should that not be part of your discussion with them, that they have an absolute responsibility for doing this?
Mr. Chair, maybe I can, just a couple of clarifications. One is, on the Cnd lease, we've already given notice to Tomlinson, and that lease will not be renewed. So that comes at the end of this year, October. So that's really the source of what's gone into that landfill and caused the environmental impact. And the councillor is quite right on the design elements. And going forward on the remedial action that will have to take place at the landfill, our expectation is that will be paid for by Tomlinson. And as the city manager had pointed out, we do have that agreement verbally in principle from Tomlinson, and we'll continue down that road.
And they would then, even though the lease is not renewed, they're still responsible for correcting the damage already done. But if we take it over, then the ongoing operation of that would be ours, but not up to that, not putting it in, surely.
They are still under agreement with the city to manage that site, and it's still their obligation to take ownership of that.
But if they don't do the work by the time the lease is up, which is pretty soon, where do you stand then?
Sorry, Chair. There's two things. The lease on the C&D just takes the C&D plant out of the equation. They still have the ownership. The management agreement on the landfill is still in action and still in effect until that landfill is filled up, is basically what the agreement says. So they are still on the hook for those costs while they're managing that site, and that's until that landfill. That's the only sunset clause in that agreement, is until that landfill is filled up.
Okay, that makes it a little clearer. And you're saying the problems are from the landfill and not from the other, which is the city is not renewing that lease. It would just close, or is the city going to operate, or what's going to happen there?
No, Chair, it will close, and they'll have to dismantle it and take it off the property.
Okay, and that's their land as well, isn't it, that piece?
Currently, Chair, it's sitting on this landfill land, in fact, in stage 5, where the last stage that would be filled in that landfill.
So they have to return it back, the city's land back in good condition of some sort?
We would expect to see it have all the proper environmental measures put in place, including an impermeable cap, stormwater abatement, etc.
Okay. I think those things are really important because there's big dollars involved with those, and other landfills are required to do them. They should not be getting a free ride on the city. There's other things that come up, but I guess they're still not paying to put Osgood waste there, but Osgood now, part of the city, pays the overall cost of all landfills, I expect. They're being paid the same way as any other household would in the city? How do we know?
Currently, the residential waste from the township of Osgood is sent to the Trail Road landfill along with all the other residential waste in the city.
Yeah, that makes sense. So many things here. The 30% discount in the rates that they've done for their own companies, which seems to be, I think I saw it was 76% of all the stuff going there. That is a huge loss of revenue and things like that. And I know that you said in the lease they have the right to set the rates. Does that mean that they can give a discount and not pay us, or they can give a discount but still have to pay us if they got the full rate? That's a little bit unclear in the report.
Mr. Chair, I think those are issues that we think can be addressed with the provision of better information, which hopefully will come from the new relationship which appears to exist in relation to this contract on the part of Tomlinson. Staff have certainly asked. There's a very long list of information that they've asked for that would help determine whether or not that was appropriate. And to be quite frank, that hasn't been forthcoming. But that is work that would have to be done that would determine whether or not that discount was reasonable or appropriate. And then more importantly, it would allow staff to determine that, along with all the other information, whether or not the revenue was accurately stated and if the expenses were appropriate, which would mean that the royalties were either understated, overstated, or accurate.
And the fines that they use for cover, if they had been sent to any other landfill, I take it they would have had to pay tipping fees for those fines?
I believe they would have to pay if they were sent to another landfill, but that's a question you could address.
That's one of the questions you have in here as well that you've mentioned, that they're saying there's no revenue from that, which means the city doesn't get its proportion, which we could use to put aside for the future issues which we're obviously going to have on that site after they've finished and closed it all.
There's a long list of issues that have to be addressed, and if the relationship with Tomlinson is improved, then it would allow staff to get answers to questions that they've been asking for a very long time.
But I do think we have to be cautious. It's sort of like they didn't provide information very easily or very much of it until they were kind of caught. Now they're going to make up for it because they know what the result could be extremely difficult for them. But I think we have to be really cautious, and not just with this company. I think this is a warning about being very cautious with any corporation that's working with us and has done for a long time. We can be a little complacent sometimes with doing things. I know we found that last year. We looked at asphalt and all those kind of things. It's all part of the same basket, really. So I think that's the city staff thing. I think you have taken it up pretty seriously from what I've heard, and I thank you for that. But I think better to get, and we have to do what we've got now and moving forward, and we have to be very cognizant that the taxpayers' dollars, this is wasting it. Not either wasting or not sort of treating correctly the value of what is for the municipality, and that's not what our job is. So thank you for bringing this forward. It's a very difficult report to read and to try to figure out, but it has to be out there, it has to be dealt with, and I'm glad it's not being, not given its due respect and importance in the past that we're going to do that now. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkinson, Councillor Cloutier, and after you it'll be Councillor Blais, Councillor Aguilar, Councillor Kadri, and Councillor Manette.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of more clarifying questions with respect to the ongoing costs and the environmental damage. The page 43 of the report says the Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change determined that the landfill was out of compliance. Can someone tell me how they came to be involved? What prompted their involvement in December?
So they've been involved with the file since the environmental compliance certificate was issued. So as a requirement of the certificate of approval, you have to put in an annual monitoring report. That report is reviewed by ministry staff. They make comments and recommendations, and then the monitoring program is adjusted based on that. So the Ministry of the Environment has had a long-term engagement on this file, and it's really only in the recent years where the environmental conditions have begun to degrade.
And that's when they asked for a remediation plan?
Exactly.
Okay. We've put forward a remediation plan, and that is a little bit more capital intensive and lower ongoing costs, and Tomlinson has objected to it. The province has accepted our remediation plan. Does the Ministry of the Environment have the final say on how the remediation plan, which remediation plan will be chosen?
Well, so they have already agreed with our concept, which is to put an impermeable cap on that landfill site and a stormwater management system to deal with the runoff from that cap. So they've agreed with that in principle. Now we have to develop a functional design, which they will also comment on and approve. So it's an iterative process. And that approval, once we put in the design at the end of the summer, could take up to a year, because they will have stormwater and groundwater reviewers and technical reviewers look at our design to ensure that it will meet the conditions of the site.
So again, that's our plan, and that's the one that's been approved by the ministry. Does Tomlinson have the opportunity to appeal that plan?
No, we are the owner of the environmental compliance certificate, and as such, we have submitted the plan.
So the issue will come down to costs. Who pays for the closing costs or the remediation plan, and who pays for the ongoing costs?
Yes, I mean, we have heard from the city manager that Tomlinson has agreed to cooperate and work with us on...
But we don't have a contract. We don't have we are still governed by the lease agreement and the memorandum of understanding from 1996 and 1998.
Correct.
So, and they have been, in some ways, we've heard non-compliant with that to date in terms of being forthcoming with information and royalty payments, and more important to me, the ongoing long-term environmental impact of this site.
Yes.
Is that a fair assessment, or?
Yes.
Okay. The site has reached capacity, I see on page 38, but is that for the and that's for the landfill?
I'd like to interject. So it has not reached capacity, so there's
still a quarter... The agreement is effective until the landfill has reached capacity, and it's at 75%.
You are correct.
Right. And for the construction demolition section, it is, we have issued a notice on May 4th to stop using that facility.
It wasn't on May 4th, but yes, previously in the spring we had sent notice that we would not be renewing the lease for this construction and demolition facility.
Chair, the May 4th date was to stop filling the landfill.
Okay, thank you. With respect to the insurance, the Auditor General mentioned that we're missing some insurance. Does that, while I recognize we don't have Schedule E, would that schedule presumably contain some liability protection for the long-term costs of environmental damage? Is that generally what we would find in an insurance document such as that is missing?
So it's my understanding that Schedule E was to outline what the insurance requirements were. Unfortunately, the city does not have a copy of Schedule E, so we can't determine what the insurance requirements were stipulated to be in the contract.
So generally, best practices, and maybe the procurement officer or the treasurer or legal might speak to this, would such a document contain protection for the city for long-term environmental liability that would be brought by the Ministry of the Environment, by an adjacent landowner, by any other stakeholder?
Mr. Chair, it's of course difficult to say what the parties agreed to in 1996. There are provisions in the agreement itself for indemnification of the city. That is separate and apart from the insurance requirements. But we do have in place, there is insurance in place. The difficulty, of course, is reconciling the insurance that is in place with what was agreed to or what arrangements were in place back in 1996. So that is the difficulty, and I think the path forward in the event that we are unable ultimately to find any record of what Schedule E contained would be to look at the existing insurance and compare that from kind of the industry standard of today as to whether it's sufficient protection.
Okay. And my final question is just back with respect to the contract inception, and again we inherited this. Does the construction and demolition, originally the 1996 agreement was just Osgood Waste, but the 1998 lease agreement meant that Tomlinson and its associated companies could bring in waste from outside of Osgood? Did it effectively become Osgood Waste for use of, and thus it could be put into the landfill?
You are correct. That is what happened.
That's a fair assessment?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Cloutier. Councillor Blais.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask some questions to make sure I'm following the history properly, to help make sure I'm understanding properly, to inform perhaps my next round of questions. So residential waste from Osgood is no longer going to this facility and hasn't been for some time. It's going to our facility in Barrhaven.
That's correct.
And so the only waste for some time that this site's been taking has been the Cnd waste per the lease.
As well as some local commercial waste from the township of Osgood.
From small businesses and institutions?
Yes.
Sure. And we've provided notice that that will not be accepted some date in October. Is that correct?
So we are not renewing the lease for the C&D facilities. Yeah. So only direct haul from businesses within the township of Osgood can use that landfill.
Perfect. That's what I wanted to clarify. So we're not sending res waste there. We're not going to renew the lease on C&D waste, but they can still accept IC&I waste from small businesses within the former township of Osgood.
Chair, right now they cannot accept anything because we've amended the ECA to temporarily suspend filling at that site.
Sure. And is it your intention to remove that temporary restriction after the remediation is complete, or are we pulling our ECA forever?
Moving forward, Chair, we would have to be absolutely certain that both the remedial action plan has been put in place to protect the groundwater from what's filled there now, and the proper protection would be put in place into the empty stage 5, and by that I mean a bottom liner similar that's at trail, so that absolutely no water could get in the landfill. And that's something that once we get over, and keep in mind the environmental remediation action plan will be, as Ms. Journeau said, the functional designs by the end of the summer. The detailed design will probably take a year, and then we'll start on construction. So we're probably 2 years out before that piece of work's in place. And then we'll discuss with Tomlinson, because they still have an agreement in place, and the agreement still gives them ability to utilize stage 5. So we'll start discussions about how that would look, if it would look.
Sure, but we own the environmental compliance certificate, right?
That's correct.
And so, as the owner of that, we bear, I would imagine, a great deal of liability as a result of owning the certificate.
Post-closure, that's correct.
Sure. So you said that we would need a great deal of certainty that the environmental problems and leaking had been solved. What does that look like? What is a great deal of certainty, I guess? And will you be coming back to committee and council to seek permission to reopen the facility?
As I said, Chair, it would be similar to the design that we utilize at Trail Road, so it's a fully engineered site, so that no groundwater can enter into the ground, and we would certainly come back with anything that we renegotiate with Tomlinson. And furthermore, we would want to make sure we're on solid financial footing with the partner.
Sure, and I apologize if I'm parsing, but there's some language that you're using which makes it sound like you don't intend to come back to council. So I want to know if before the site reopens for the acceptance of any waste, are you coming back to committee and council to get the blessing and the approval of this body to do so?
Absolutely.
Okay. What is the process of negotiating with Tomlinson for these remedial costs? Is it standard negotiating and then arbitration, or going to arbitration right away? What's the mechanics of that going to look like, without getting into details of the...
Mr. Chair, we had that discussion, quite a frank discussion with the president, and they expressed no interest in pursuing a litigious approach to this, either through arbitration or through the courts. I think that what the Tomlinson Group of Companies is also realizing, and was expressed at the meeting, is that they do a substantial amount of business with the City of Ottawa on a broader, from their entire group of companies.
And when they look at the context of this in terms of cost, in terms of what it actually costs to cap it, it's actually a very minor cost, even though the implications are significant environmentally potentially. And they are interested in putting this behind them and working through to a solution. So they've committed, and I asked them for a commitment before the meeting left that post the audit tabling that we would meet immediately to start discussing terms and commitments in writing in terms of what they would do to deal with the mitigation and the costs associated with that, and they've agreed to do that.
And was the subject of reimbursement for missed royalties or overpayment at all addressed in terms of going back through time?
No, not yet. What I told them was that because I obviously couldn't share with them the audit recommendations as I had seen them before this committee meeting. So I did not share those audit recommendations with them, but I did tell them that before we could move on to any kind of commercial discussion and the other things we need to discuss commercially, we have to deal with the environmental issue and the responsibility for mitigating the environmental measures, because our council will expect that to be done. That's exactly what I told them, and that there will be further discussion around the contract and moving forward, and they've agreed to that.
What kind of time threshold are you giving this? Because the auditor is recommending that we blacklist them, and I presume he thinks that we should do that pretty quickly. There are obviously lots of implications to that. So how long are you going to give this back and forth negotiation before we go full Monty on this?
Well, the way I view it, Chair, is that before we trigger, the procurement bylaw sections that apply to the recommendation, that we are now in the process, as you heard from Mr. Noel and Mr. Wiley, of completing the design and getting a more detailed synopsis summary of what the costs would be. Those discussions will be happening over the summer as we finalize that. My understanding is by the end of the summer we'll have a much better sense of what that costs. We'll be meeting over the summer to work towards what that is. We have a sense of what the cost will be. And so the timeline is, you're talking months in terms of getting agreement for that, and then the further discussion will be on implementing the rest of the auditor recommendations through the rest of the year.
Sure. Does Tomlinson currently have any ongoing construction projects that would take them beyond the 2018 season? Like, are there any multi-year projects ongoing where they would...
I'm going to ask Mr. Gonti if he knows that answer to that question.
Mr. Chair, I don't have all the details in front of me, but any contracts that Tomlinson currently has right now would definitely extend into next year, because we always have a warranty period on any works that are done.
Yeah. And I presume, I'm sure that I've seen their vehicles out at LRT construction sites, right? Yeah. Sure. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Blake. Councillor Egli?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I want to go back to the insurance for a minute if I can, because I'm still confused. So is it that we don't have insurance at all, or is it that we're not sure if we have the right insurance, or is it we're not sure we have the right insurance at the right time?
Mr. Chair, there is insurance in place. The question is, does the insurance that is in place match what was agreed to between Tomlinson and the Township of Osgood in 1996, which would have been set out in Schedule E? So it's the fact that we don't have a copy of Schedule E for comparative purposes to determine whether the insurance that is currently in place, that Tomlinson has in place for the site, matches that.
Okay, so I guess two follow-up questions then. Are we satisfied that the insurance that is in place currently is adequate to cover any damages that we may suffer?
That's the work that staff are undertaking. In the event that they can't find and we see no evidence of Schedule E to ensure that that insurance that is in place is adequate in the circumstances. So we don't mean that the contamination today is on Tomlinson's property.
Okay. So again, will you be coming back to committee and council if and when you find out the answer to whether we have the proper insurance?
Chair, we can certainly issue something to committee and council once we get to the bottom of the insurance question.
And I guess the more fundamental question is, how do we lose Schedule E? How does nobody have Schedule E? Neither the parties, neither the parties' lawyers, the department responsible for supervising the contract. How does that happen?
Chair, there's no evidence that Schedule E was ever part of the documentation obtained by the new city at amalgamation.
Okay. It still doesn't answer what happened to it, though. I get it. We didn't get it. Was the city of Osgood using outside legal counsel at the time?
Yes, they were, Mr. Chair.
And have they been asked? Because there's a requirement for them to keep their files. Have they been asked for Schedule E?
I'm not certain.
Well, it seems to me that would be a fairly basic thing to do. They have certain requirements under the Law Society and under their own insurance, well, we're talking about insurance, to ask them the question as to whether they still have that in file somewhere. So if that hasn't been done, I would suggest that should be done sooner rather than later.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Next, if I heard correctly from the auditor, there have been a number of meetings, lots of meetings, between Tomlinson, between the city, going back years, where there's absolutely no documentation, no notes, no minutes. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, what we look for is support for the oversight of a contract. And at the time, and through the course of the audit, and up until a couple of days ago, there was nothing prior to 2014. And 2010 to 2014 was the period that we were looking for, and there was nothing in that interim. There was documentation from 2014 and on, but nothing prior to that. But we did indicate that the other day we were told that they have found some files. Whether or not that addresses oversight or not, we cannot say.
Okay, and are you satisfied that whatever process we have or policy we have in place now for taking minutes of meetings is satisfactory going forward?
I think we indicate in the report that there are some areas where they could be strengthened, but certainly the oversight since 2014. There's evidence of it, and there's no doubt that the current players are engaged with the file. I attended the facility. I was out there with staff. There's no question that staff are engaged now.
So I don't know if you can answer this question on whether it's too wide-ranging for this particular piece of work, but the last few times you've appeared in front of us, a key discussion piece has been contract management. So are you satisfied that in the city writ large that there's a policy or practice in place now that covers something as basic as somebody in the meeting is appointed to take minutes and append those minutes to the file?
I think the response to the recommendation that we had indicated that there are policies and procedures in place. And as I have said before, when you take people who, because this is what the case is in other parts of the state, who have spent their career delivering a service and they are suddenly managing a contract where someone else is delivering that service, then we have to make sure that there are policies and procedures to support them, and they exist, and those exist now, and that they are aware of them, and that their supervisors ensure that they're in compliance with them. And time will tell, and I assure you that we will continue to look at contract management in future audits. It's one of the areas that I indicated to the Audit Committee that we would focus on.
Okay, so maybe this is a larger question for Mr. Kanellakis. In light of the fact that, again, there are pieces of documentation missing, there are minutes that don't appear to have been taken. Are you satisfied in your role that across the city now there is a direction and a policy that for meetings that minutes are kept for meetings of substance, Mr. Kanellakis, and that they're being appended and saved to our file so that next year and the year after we don't have our auditor here again saying, well, there's no documentation, we don't have any record of what happened at those meetings?
Mr. Chair, we have heard the message around contract administration. To that end, a memo was circulated to members of council in May that outlined a number of the initiatives that we have underway to improve contract administration practices at the city. This relates to updated policies and procedures, improved payment methods, as well as staff training. And so this is going to be an ongoing initiative. It certainly is a priority, and it's something that we've committed to improving.
So if Mr. Hughes reached out to you and randomly asked for 6 different contract management files today and said, I need to see the minutes over the meetings that have happened over the last 2 years, what do you think the success or compliance rate would be?
Well, there's a number of audits underway related to contract administration, so Mr. Hughes will certainly be speaking to that. And I think it will be dependent on the file. These are ongoing initiatives to standardize our process. In some, there will be very strong contract administration practices. In others, there will be room for improvement. And so it'll be dependent on the file.
So I guess what I'm hearing, Mr. Kanellakis, we don't have a citywide policy for contract management in terms of keeping good record keeping around meetings.
No, what you're hearing, Mr. Chair, is that, as the Chief Procurement Officer said, is that the Auditor General has delivered a number of reports over the last year that have pointed to a trend in contract management policies and procedures and practices needing to improve. And we've taken that, and I've asked our General Manager of Corporate Services, Marion Simuluk, working with Will and the rest of our management team to implement the policies, procedures, the training, the changes that we had to make in the organization to improve ourselves going forward. You've asked a question, Mr. Chair, a question was asked about historically, can I go back 2 years? Well, obviously, the last 2 years we have not been doing so well on some aspects of that. I'm looking for improvement going forward. Mr. Hughes will validate that. I'm starting to see that improvement now because we're making that a focus. It's a message we're delivering to all of our management and supervisors on a consistent basis, and the training is going to be the most important piece as we bring people through so they understand their accountabilities in all aspects of contract management. And as Mr. McDonald said, there will be much more rigor to some contracts because of the complexity of them compared to the one-off things where we can manage them differently. But we will be working with our staff going forward, and that's my commitment going forward to council.
No, and I do appreciate that.
Councillor, can we just let the city solicitor weigh in too?
Sure.
Make a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to supplement what's been said earlier, not on the specific subject of contract management, but on the overall policy issue, the City of Ottawa does have an information management policy that does have requirements with regards to detailing such minutes as the council mentioned and ensuring that at every level all decision-making is recorded and kept in an appropriate fashion.
But that's not happening. Is that fair to say? Or hadn't been happening in a consistent way up until...
We've had inconsistencies. We acknowledge that. We have accepted the recommendation of the Auditor General. Contract management has been put at the top priority of one of our top priorities for our senior management to improve that. And we've taken initiative in the last few months that have started moving us towards that.
Okay, thank you for that. But just one quick follow-up question on the potential ban for Tomlinson. I just want some clarification. Tomlinson is a group of companies. They have a lot of different divisions, a lot of different related companies. Would the ban apply to Thompson in its entirety, or just would apply to, because you've indicated that our relationship with Tomlinson in other areas is quite good. So does the policy say Tomlinson as a whole, or just the division of Tomlinson that's been maintaining and working at this particular landfill?
Mr. Chair, it would be all related parties.
So we wouldn't do business with Tomlinson, and they wouldn't fix our roads, they wouldn't do anything?
If we took action to prohibit them from bidding, it would apply to all of their related companies.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Eglay. Councillor Kadri.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And, obviously another file that's very interesting in terms of waste management in this city. Spring Hill or Tomlinson Group has been in front of council on a number of occasions over the last 8 years, requesting some kind of modifications to their operations at Spring Hill. Whether it be an expansion of intake of garbage, whether it be an expansion of hours of operation. And they were in front of Environment Committee, I guess, as late as 2016, November 2016. Now, they actually applied to the province for some of those expansions. So they weren't really asking the city, but the city did have a role to play in providing some information, I guess, to the province about, what they were requesting, what the company was requesting. My question this morning is that at any point, and I beg to go back to the legal in this case, that was there any mention of any of these issues at the last contact with Spring Hill management, whether it be Tomlinson or someone else, about some of these issues that we were facing already back in 2016 or even before that, in terms of their operations and or in terms of what the concerns from the city were? Was any of that ever mentioned either directly to Tomlinson or through to the ministry when we were reporting in for an environmental assessment process?
Mr. Chair, I appreciate the question to legal. I'd have to defer to operations staff in that regard.
Yeah, to my knowledge, Tomlinson was not seeking any environmental assessments for that landfill site. They have approached the city and asked for us to approve conditions on their environmental compliance approval that we have not brought forward. So it's, but we meet with Tomlinson monthly. There are documented meeting minutes. So since 2014, we have been very active on this file, and we have been following all best management practices, and as well as filing those minutes appropriately through our electronic filing system. So the management of that project now is, I would say, well done. Thanks, Mr. Auditor. So he acknowledges that the file is appropriately managed at this time.
Thank you for that response, Ms. Journo, and I do appreciate that, the process has improved, and I do thank staff as well as our AG for making sure that that happens. But my question still comes back to the fact that when they came for approval of extension of their hours, as an example, why wasn't the committee, or committee chair at least, made aware of some of these concerns that the city was facing with Tomlinson at the time?
The approval extending the hours was not approved, so again it was the City of Ottawa who would have to submit those approvals to the Ministry of the Environment, and we weren't necessarily always in agreement with what they were proposing to us. So we've always had an interaction with Tomlinson on their undertakings and what they're proposing.
Again, I appreciate that comment, Ms. Journo, but my question is, at any point when the city was aware of some of these challenges that we were facing with Tomlinson or with the Spring Hill landfill, did anybody from the city staff, today or maybe previous staff, made either the ministry aware of some of these concerns or made the city council aware of some of these concerns?
Yeah, so yes, we are. Tomlinson is required to report to the Ministry of the Environment annually. The environmental conditions at that site, it was showing that there was degradation of the groundwater. It's been noted since about 2012, and so the ministry is very well aware of those issues. And, city staff as well as the ministry have been working with Tomlinson to try and address those concerns. The environmental issues increased significantly in 2017, and that's when the city took immediate steps to deal with the issues at that site, and here we are now.
Mr. Chair, if I can add, I think the councillor is asking, was the ministry aware of the difficult relationship with Tomlinson? And certainly they were aware of that. However, having said that, they look upon the city as the owner of the landfill to conduct the mitigation that's required. But they were certainly aware of the difficult situation or the difficult relationship with Tomlinson.
Thank you for that, Mr. Riley. And then again, just coming back to yesterday's council meeting, when, Councillor Chernyshenko's motion that was carried forward, that is the kind of concern I think we all have sitting around this table, is the approval of the landfill. Any landfill is up to the province, yet in this case, we as a city are getting hung with a headache that we're going to be responsible for from here to eternity, because landfills don't go away. Once they're there, they're a blemish on the site, and they leach, and other functions happen. And that is the concern that I think both Councillor Chernyshenko and myself was trying to advise the city, that in the future, whenever we are asked to have a landfill established in one area or another, and not anybody really wants a landfill, but if that process continues forward, that we best be aware that we should have some authority as a city to say we should put it here or we shouldn't put it here, especially now that we're approving development, or we have been for a number of years, development as close as 500 meters to a landfill. And, finding out these kind of facts after the fact doesn't sit well with me. I'm being very honest with you, because the reason why it doesn't sit well with me is I went through this fight along with Councillor Shanteri and a couple other members of the council when Carp Road landfill was expanding. And the community is assured over and over again, the issues wouldn't be there, and, everything will be looked after. It's a well-engineered landfill, and so on. Here we are today, where the city knew about some of these issues with Spring Hill landfill, and we're facing the backlog of that today. Now, I know the management has changed in terms of solid waste management in the city, and it's probably changed 2 or 3 times. Coming back to Councillor Aguilar's questions about management of reports and minutes of meetings, I'm glad to see that that's getting focused today, but that should have been on a focus from day one. That is part of our responsibility, both as council members and as city staff. And I just want to make sure that from here forward, we're not going to face the same challenges. And I thank Auditor General for doing the reports on an ongoing basis on the solid waste stream in the city. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Cadrick. Councillor Manette, please. And that's the end of questions after you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Obviously, everybody's had a lot of questions around the table, and I think it's been quite in-depth. I guess mine is a fairly simple question, is would it be possible when presenting initial audit reports to establish a projected follow-up time so that when we have a better understanding of what the audit would be dealing with?
Mr. Chair, through you to the councillor, we generally, in most circumstances, go back to do our follow-up within 2 to 3 years. We can and have gone back sooner, and in other circumstances, we've waited. So, for example, the ISD audits, there was, I think, 4 audits that we did, and 1 special project, special review that was done in ISD. The department said, wait a second, the findings are so significant that we're not going to handle them piecemeal. We're absolutely going to re-engineer the way they do business. And I met with staff and agreed to back off for a couple of years to give them some time to do the work. And you saw that today, that the bulk of the recommendations have been implemented. So the other exception, of course, was this one. And the follow-up was held up by the arbitration. And to be quite frank, we just decided that it had been so long since we'd even done the initial audit that it was in imperative that, given the risks associated with a file of this nature, that it was imperative that we do additional work, and that's why we decided to do the follow-up and this additional work. And I can tell you that we will likely, given the importance of this file and the significance of the recommendation 8 that was up on the screen up until a few minutes ago, we will likely be coming back sooner rather than later for this follow-up.
That's great. I understand this is a one-off. I mean, we've done audits before.
Absolutely.
Some of the things we're looking at is 2010, and it really goes far back. So I want to thank you for the explanation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Minot. So no more questions. So is the report received from the committee, please? Councillor DeRusse, received? Received? It goes on to council, yes, of course. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hughes, for your presentation and your hard work on this file. Okay, the committee has decided that we do not need to go in camera on this item, but thanks to the staff and the Auditor General's office, the committee's received the answers that we wanted to have on this report. So we won't be moving in camera. So is there any notices of motion? Seeing none. Any inquiries? No. Other business? No. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Cruiser? Adjourn? Okay. Thank you all. The next meeting will be the 28th of June. Okay, received, sorry, we'll just clarify that. For that last item, we receive and approve the Auditor General's follow-ups. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Councillor Wilkinson.